2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Professor Jim Jost joins us talking all things politics. Good morning, Jim.
Morning, Mark.
We're still talking about the budget. Now, we want to talk this week about how the government has fared. It's been out for a little while now. We've had a chance to digest it. Normally, when budgets have come in, en masse, we love to complain and find something to complain about. I know I'll get crucified for this, but there doesn't seem a lot in this one that we could have whinged about, but it doesn't stop us, does it?
Well, there are parts of the budget. I mean, overall, one would have to say that from the government's perspective, the budget was a vast improvement on past budgets. It sort of had a little bit for everybody, but also some areas it sort of pulled back money and so forth. I mean, the banks are complaining mightily at the moment, but it's a relatively popular measure for most people that the banks maybe contribute a little more, given that they seem to be doing very, very well.
Really? The banks are doing all right?
But there has been a bit of pushback from the banking sector, but I think the government needs to sort of, it's a popular measure. It needs to then figure out how it's going to deal with the issue where the banks say, well, we're just going to pass this little price rise on.
Well, that's what they've said. Hey, any tax or levy, it doesn't get absorbed because it's the government's term. It just gets passed on, which of course means us. The government's then said, well, you just shop around as the banking consumers, but also taking a shot at the bank saying, come on, guys, pay your fair share. You're doing okay.
I think that's where the Turnbull government's coming from, and it's met a reasonable response from the general public. But as we said, not from the banking sector. Politically, it may cause it a few hiccups, but I think, it's one of those measures that the Senate is likely to not cause too many problems with. But there are other issues that may be problems for the government, and it's really the response perhaps of the senators and how they will work with the measures, and also the way in which the government puts those measures through. And it's got to get a little bit cleverer. But what's really interesting, that given the general public reception of the budget, the government's still getting a bit of flack, particularly from the Australian, and it's and a number of other areas. And it's sort of, I think, unfortunate for the government, but it sort of sends a signal that all is not well in the sort of coalition ranks, that the Australian and other Murdoch newspapers have been strong supporters of Tony Abbott. So news stories that cast the government in a more negative light as a result of the budget, or cast the Prime Minister as not showing the right sort of leadership, continues to give perhaps Tony Abbott that little crack of light that he can exploit to perhaps make another tilt. He's continually saying, well, he's not interested in the leadership, and he's right behind his leader.
They all say
exactly. But I think it's really interesting that while there's plenty that perhaps people, shall we say, on the Labor side of politics might criticise heavily in the budget, and a range of people might make some very fair criticisms of it, overall, from the government's perspective and from the general public's perspective, it's a relatively uncontroversial budget, one that shows a sense of leadership and a bit of forward thinking on the part of the government, not making wild budgeting measures or whatever, but taking a fairly measured approach. You would think then that this would signify for the various commentators and so forth that the government has turned a corner in terms of how it is managing the political dimension of its budget process.
Well, it really kind of was make or break time, this budget, wasn't it? And it was very interesting. I was waiting to see what Tony Abbott had to say, if he was going to say, and he's been very, very quiet, and I think maybe just waiting and seeing how it's all received. But overall, we still just love to have that little whinge.
Well, that's true, but I think a lot of Tony Abbott supporters in the media have sort of done what he, put his point of view forward without associating it with him as such. So I think it's sort of interesting. It's a sort of indicator, a bit of a barometer perhaps, that perhaps the government, or at least the Turnbull leadership, is not as solid as perhaps Malcolm Turnbull would like. But at present, if he and his senior members are able to negotiate effectively with the crossbench in the Senate, then it's likely, if they can get most of their measures through without too much controversy, then politically they will have succeeded this year where they haven't in the past.
We will wait and wonder on that. It's all about the Senate as always. Thank you, Jim. We'll catch you next time.
Yep, my pleasure, Mark.
Right here at 2NURFM 103.7.